welcome to our first at home of 2023. My name is Lynn Hulse. I am one of the panel that runs 19th century dress and textiles reframed, and we've got other members of the panel here. We've got Robin, Anna, Kate and Hannah, who's one of our speakers, and Kim, I think I've seen come in as well, who's dialed in from Canada. So welcome to the other committee members and welcome to all of our attendees. It's great to have such a good turnout today. The theme of today's session is looking at clothing and textiles from 19th century Ulster. And we have speakers here coming from a wide range of backgrounds. We've got people who are doing research into Ulster textiles and clothing. We've got a museum curator, we've got a practitioner and reenactor, and a collector. So really, bringing a lot of different skills to the table, which is wonderful. Often we have a museum paper at the end, a short presentation about museum, but on this occasion we've got 4 speakers, so we've got really quite a full programme today. So I'm going to sort of forge ahead. Each of the talks will last about 12 minutes and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of each paper. And if there's time at the end, we can mop up some more questions then. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker this afternoon, who is Fiona McKelvie. Fiona's a very dear friend and colleague. She's had a career for more than 30 years in the business, first as export sales manager for Liberty in the wholesale division. She comes originally from Belfast and has just relocated back, in fact, to Northern Ireland, and is speaking to us from a Scotch mill, from an Irish linen mill, so Ulster linen mill, which couldn't even be a better setting for today's talk. She's now working on researching the legacy of Irish linen, and she's going to be speaking to us about John Shaw Brown, which is one of the major manufacturers of Ulster linens. Fiona, would you like to share your screen, please? Right. Oh, beginning.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, fine, perfect.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Fine, okay. Well, Lynn, thanks very much for the introduction, and delighted to be here. And yes, speaking Scotch mill in the middle of County Down. So my topic this afternoon is John Shaw Brown, who were the company behind Shamrock Irish Linens, a masterclass in marketing. And the company dates back to the mid-18th century when they were producing beautiful hand-woven linens, but they were quick to move their production across to power looms as that became more readily available. And by the mid-19th century, they had a reputation for weaving some of the very finest damask linens, and their telegraphic address was an advertisement from the Graphic magazine dated April the 18th, 1885. And as you can see, they weren't shy of telling the world about the quality of their linens. They were very much ahead of their time in the marketing of their goods, being one of the first to register a trademark, the Shamrock. But they weren't content with merely showing it on packaging and labeling. They also decided to incorporate the device into each piece of linen damask by way of a shamrock woven into every item. Now, the advertisement appeared in the magazine in 1885, and as you can see, it was of modest size, but my goodness, they packed a punch with that very simple, straightforward graphic of the shamrock and the words trademark. They actually do mention, see that each cloth, etc., and each dozen of napkins bears this trademark ticket in brackets, but in reduced size. So whilst your attention had been drawn to the bold shamrock of the advertisement, you were reassured that it would be more modest on the linens that you would buy. So they were not going to hide their light under a bushel. They had more than 100 years reputation. They tell us that their table linens are unsurpassed for excellence of quality, durability and wear. beauty of designs, and so it goes on. Now, they weren't only going to have their labels, as I mentioned, but they wanted to weave it into each piece of linen. And the easiest way to show you is the image here on the left, which is a napkin proof cloth. Now, these were woven as a test piece before the linen would go into production. It was much easier to see any faults or errors in the two-tone of red with natural warp or blue with natural warp. And as you can see from the image on the right, which is a finished piece of John Shaw Brown linen, it's much more subtle and it's difficult to make out the finer detail. Now, the shamrock might seem like a very subtle motif to us today, but at that time it was really quite a bold decision. It's thought that the woven shamrock trademark was maybe only reserved for the very finest of their linens, and certainly there is evidence that some of their wares were marked by an inked stamp to one corner, as we see here on the right. This napkin has been machine hemmed, which possibly indicates a lesser quality of cloth, as their finest goods at this period would have been hemmed by hand. Of course, all of their packaging carried paper labels as well, and any printed materials such as letter headings and price lists were liberally decorated with the motif, as well as referring to the many medals that had been awarded to them at international exhibitions. This is a box set of table linens, and just look at how many opportunities they took to show the shamrock motif and mention their prowess on the international stage. Top left, we have the motif which comes from the top of the box. On the end of the box, you have, again, two labels with shamrocks all the way around the edge, shamrock repeated again on the size label to the left, and at each corner of the Made in Ireland all pure linen label to the right. And when you take off the lid, oh my goodness, you're met with more shamrocks and more of their reputation of excellence in their field. So a wonderfully embossed label telling us that they've won labels at London in 1851, Philadelphia and Paris, and that being a gold medal. The type of letterhead that they would have sent out at the time is similar to this. And you can see that by this period, they had also gained access to telegraphic addresses in both London and Toronto. And I think it gives us a sense of how important they were in their field, that they actually managed to get in right at the very beginning to register the name damask for John Shaw Brown Shamrock linens. Their first gold medal was in Paris in 1867. And you can see that the first local exhibition, which was the Irish Flax Improvement Association, was in 1844. And then various exhibitions, London and Dublin and so on, up to 1899 was the last of the 19th century. And I think that buoyed up by their first gold medal of 1867, they must have really realized that this was something that they needed to build on. They spent a lot of their budget on advertising at the time, and it was really important to set themselves apart from their competition. And inspired by their gold medal win of 1867, they produced the most wonderful design folio in around 1868. It really was a quite spectacular piece. It's a very large size. This folio is actually in the library at Ulster University in Belfast, and I'm very grateful to the librarian there for allowing me to view it last year, take photographs, and to be able to share it with you today. And I understand there were about 100 copies printed. You can see it has this magnificent frontispiece, which shows us the Ellen Works, which are just outside Belfast, which was one of their main manufacturing places. And the very opulence of the design on the cover is very much reminiscent of the types of design of their damask at the time. But of course, mention of the trademark centre bottom and to each of the four corners, they reproduce the medals that they had received up to this period. So here we have a close-up of the four that are featured to each of the four corners. The index is really quite remarkable in how wide a breadth of design it shows us. Again, you've got the shamrock to each of the four corners. The main focus is on their traditional floral and botanical designs. After all, this was a time when there was a lot of plant exploration, many plant species being brought home from far off lands. And this type of design book was really offering you an opportunity. If you couldn't quite stretch your budget to having your own glass house to grow these very sought after and much admired varieties, then you could at least demonstrate your understanding of the latest discoveries by entertaining your guests at a table laid with linen damask featuring elaborate renditions of the plants. The names are really quite amazing. We get things like corncockle morandii barclayana and eranthemum and convolvulus. So you get very simple designs as well included, such as this bay leaf pattern. The breadth of design shown is quite stunning in this particular volume. You would have on the right-hand page a full lithograph of the design, and then on the opposite page, you would have a list of the items that were available. So here you have a close-up of the corncockle design. Then you have the hibiscus and lepageria, two more specimens that had recently been brought back to the British Isles. But they weren't the only ones available. You could also have Masonic emblems or fox hunting and coursing. And of course, ancient Egypt hadn't been forgotten either. The way that the designs were presented were with, as I mentioned, the lithograph on the right, and then you have a full listing of all the designs that were available. And the interesting fact of this is not only were they wanting to show you how elaborate their designs were and the medals that they'd won, but they weren't going to miss an opportunity to use this as a selling tool. So they weren't just going to illustrate the designs, they wanted to ensure that orders could be placed from the detail that was contained in the volume. So as I said in the title of the presentation, theirs really was a masterclass in marketing. But also they didn't ignore their simpler and more commonplace designs. So you have rose and shamrock, for example, and here you can see the absolute breadth of the various items that could be purchased in this particular style. You have napkins, you have slips, which would have been the equivalent of butler's trays or side cloths, numerous quantities of cloth pieces, and finally, toilet covers. So your maid could make sure that things were discreetly removed from your bedroom at the end of a night's sleep by covering the pot with a rose and shamrock cloth. Now, the company continued in business well into the 20th century, but like so many other mills, the doors finally closed in the early 1980s. Some of you may recall a project run by the BBC called The World in 100 Objects. A proof napkin from John Shaw Brown was one of the items selected. And I think it's testament to the skill and reputation of the firm as one of the finest in its field. And that can be viewed at the Irish Linen Centre in Lisburn. After the closure of many of the proof cloths were sent to the Folk Museum in Toal. Now, this particular set of napkins resulted in a very fortuitous meeting some years ago. They were sold to a customer of mine in Australia, and I mentioned that they had the John Shaw Brown shamrock in the top right-hand corner. We exchanged emails, and it transpired that she, in fact, was a descendant of John Shaw Brown. Her father had emigrated to Perth after the war, and tragically a fire had destroyed all the family linens he owned. So it's been a pleasure getting to know her and help her find some John Shaw Brown linens to replace those that perished in the fire. And I'm delighted to say that Carolyn. So Carolyn, thank you for allowing me access to your family archives and showing me the wonderful archive material that that you have. And in particular, I've been able to show the letterheading and the price list covers that we've looked at today. So that's the story of John Shaw Brown, just a very brief glimpse into the marketing campaign that they ran during the latter part of the 19th century. Quite unique in many ways. Thank you very much.
Fiona, thank you very much indeed. What a wonderful introduction to one of the major producers of Irish linen, and some absolutely fabulous designs. I mean, certainly a volume that one would love to get one's hands on and do a lot more research. I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's our question mistress today, who's looking after the Q&A. I think there are a lot of questions coming in. So Anna, if I can pass over to you, please.
Yeah, hi. So if anybody has questions, the thing to do is to type it into the chat and we'll get through as many as we can. So there are lots of comments about how astonishing the designs are. Hannah kicks off with the trademark looks so modern, it's so clean for a 19th century item. The labels are exquisite. Lynn is asking, who are the recipients of the folio, the 1868 folio, because 100 copies were produced. Are they shops or individual customers, or how were they disseminated?
I imagine, I don't have access to a list, but I imagine that they would have been distributed to their key customers, and they were selling widely internationally at this time. I mean, Harrods, for example, John Shaw Brown was one of the 2 companies that they would buy damask linens for. So I imagine that one of them would have been presented to the appropriate buyer in department stores such as Harrods and their many customers, South America, North America, and throughout the Commonwealth.
Would you say that this is why the Shamrock carries such weight? Did it speak? Did it have the same kudos within Ireland? Sorry, I'm not being very articulate here. Is it mainly for the overseas customers?
Well, no, but I mean, I think most of the major mills of the time would have included a Shamrock design in their portfolio of designs. It was such something that was associated so much with Ireland, and that very much was something that was promoted by all of the manufacturers. They would have, you know, pretty little cottages on their packaging, or shamrocks, or colleens, or Celtic towers, all of this type of thing. So actually, John Shaw Brown getting in, being as you know, very much leading in the field as they were, to actually be able to trademark it for their particular linen was really quite a bold move, and to be able to get in early enough to have it. Right. The Merchandise Marks Act came in 1862, so a few years before they won that gold medal. And that was the first time that there could be prosecution of one company if they copied the motif of another. Okay. But the actual Trademarks Act itself didn't come until 1875, but there was already some protection afforded by the Act of 1862. Right.
Lynn is asking, who designed these amazing cloths? Who are the actual designers?
The damask industry in Northern Ireland was such that they needed vast quantities of damask designed, and the local art college, technical college as it is now, was producing many talented artists who worked in this field, and they had access to some wonderful material close at hand. The Botanical Gardens in Belfast was one of the largest at the time, so they, you know, the designers working in Belfast mills were able to go and visit on a Sunday. It was only open to the public on a Sunday, and they could actually see firsthand these plants that were being brought back from expeditions far and wide. And the detail was really quite remarkable that they were able to achieve.
And would you say there was any cross-fertilization with the arts and crafts movement?
Oh, I would think, yes, I would think there would have been. But although this was possibly a little bit earlier, but yes, there was always a very strong botanical and floral side to what was produced. But then you've got the more interesting ones, you know, the slightly more unusual ones like the Masonic ones and you know, the Egyptian revival type ones as well. So they were always quite topical.
Sharon is asking a little bit about the events they got the medals in 1897. A competition or an exhibition, would you say?
They would have been the international exhibitions that were happening at the time.
Okay. Hannah is asking where she can see the cloth. Are there any Egyptian designs or the Masonic ones that you can actually
Personally,
see?
I've not come across any. I do keep an eye open. I've come across the I did probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I had a set of the hunting ones. So they had game birds and everything around the side. They're quite remarkable. Now, actually, in Cultural, they do have proof cloths of a very similar design of game birds and set in amongst ferns. But as for actual finished damask, I'm not sure where you would necessarily find that.
Kay is asking, has anyone had a go at remaking these, given the interest in people wanting to learn old methods, or has the skill vanished?
I think that's a question that's going to be answered by our next two speakers, actually. So I'm going to bust in there, Anna,
Okay.
rather than
Absolutely right.
stealing their thunder, and I think I'll let them come up with the answers to that question.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. I'm going to first of all say thank you again, Fiona, for a wonderful presentation. That's a great introduction to John Shaw Brown and certainly to Ulster Textiles. So I'm going to now pass on to our second speaker today, who is Dr. Ciaran Toal. And we've already heard about the Irish Linen Centre. Fiona mentioned it in her talk. Ciaran is a researcher and acting keeper of collections at the Irish Linen Centre and Lisburn Museum, which is a wonderful resource. I mean, it's really keeping up with the history. And has acquired collections from the various mills as they have closed down, sadly. So there are very few linen mills left now in Northern Ireland. Ciaran has come to talk to us today because I think many of you may not be familiar with the Irish Linen Centre in Lisburn, and I was particularly keen that Ciaran should come and talk to us about the collections there. So I'm going to pass over to you, Ciaran. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Can everyone see my PowerPoint?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, great. So as Lynn mentioned, my name is Ciaran. I'm acting keeper of collections here at the Irish Linen Centre and Lisburn Museum. I'm going to talk about some of our textile related items in the collection, and I've chosen these because they're emblematic of the collection and they tell the story in a small way of Lisburn, the wider Lagan Valley, and the Irish linen industry, which is really the mission of the museum. These Lisburn and the Irish linen industry. That's what we try to do. I'm going to try very quickly to cover some histories from above and below, and some more elegant items in the collection. Some you might think are more mundane. But firstly, a quick overview of what we have in the collection. If my PowerPoint would change, there we go. So about 15,000 items in the collection, and this broadly reflects the two sides of the museum because about 50% of our collections are linen related, although there's lots of overlap, as you'd imagine, between Lisburn and the Irish linen industry. We have thousands of photographs, a lot of them relating to the linen industry. We have archives, rare books, as well as the Linen Industry Research Association library, which came to us in the late 90s. And if any of you are working on linen related projects, it's a great resource. It's free to use, and I'd encourage you to drop us an email, and you'd be very welcome to come and use that resource. So the first object that I'd look at today is this. Again, my slide will change. Yep, it's an early 19th century silk empire dress with an Irish linen lining. Now, how do we know it's Irish linen? Well, amazingly, we can see the stamp of the white linen seal on the lining of the dress and just down by the hem, and it carries this stamp, which is Robert Johnson from the civil parish of Derryaki, Lisburn, roughly date between 1800 to 1820. And it's a really remarkable object because it's a link to the Irish Linen Board, because the crowned harp is that symbol of the Irish Linen Board, which was established in 1711 to exercise a watchful supervision over the linen industry, from the growing of processing of flax to the weaving, its sale, and the export of cloth. And the controls that were put in place by the Linen Board helped secure Ireland's reputation for producing fine linen. White linen seals were introduced in around 1719, and they went through all the way to towards the end of the Linen Board's journey in 1825 or so. And what we recognise as the Irish linen industry today starts in the 17th century, and it's very well established by the 18th century. And that history, one of increasing organisation and control, is reflected in the linen seal on the hem of this dress and the stamp of the Irish Linen Board. So every time I walk past this dress in the gallery and have a look at it, I mean, I just think it's a really remarkable object, because in this dress it encapsulates that whole history. So if you're very welcome to come into the museum and have a look at the dress. The next item, which I mean, if we had room 101, this is another item that I would put in it, and it is this item. So not far from where Robert Johnson would have lived in Lisburn was the Ulster Provincial School, which is now Friends, which is a sort of top grammar school here in Northern Ireland. It was established in the late 18th century by a bequest from a wealthy Quaker bleacher, John Hancock. And this sampler was produced in the school in 1810. It's a band sampler on linen, and it was produced by Hannah Morrison, who was a student at Friends School, or the Ulster Provincial College School as it was then. And samplers were really used by the school with female students to give them a practical acquaintance with needleworks. You know, once they moved on and got married, they'd be able to produce laundry marks or do embroidery at home or mend clothes. But they were also useful for displaying the skills acquired by students when they were there in the school. And as students left the school, these samplers often went with them. They travelled, and this item is really remarkable because it turned up in a sale in Vancouver, Washington, United States, and eventually made its way back to the museum several years ago. And what we know is that when Hannah left school, she brought the sampler with us. She disappears from the Quaker records, and we don't know what happened to her after her marriage to John Burroughs. But I wanted to include this because, as you'll see later on with some of the objects, other objects we have, I mean, I think this is really reflective of what we might think of as domestic or everyday textiles that were produced in Lisburn in the Lagan Valley in the 19th century, and what we might think of as a textile from below. And we can contrast that with some of the damask that we'll talk about in a second. The third item I'd like to submit to room 101, if I can, is a spool of thread from Barber's mill at Hilden in Lisburn. So the company dates from the late 18th century. John Barber from Paisley in Scotland. He was a muslin manufacturer and sold it in Dublin. He eventually settles at the plantation in Lisburn in the late 18th century. After he dies, his son William moves the business to Hilden, which was on the site of an old Huguenot bleaching green. And the company grows, and it grows significantly. Soon they have several hundred employees, and by the end of the century they have factories in Germany, several factories in the United States. And 1898, Barber and Sons, they renamed the Linen Thread Company, and they're the largest conglomerate and producer of linen thread in the world. I think Barber's marketing department is completely underappreciated. If you look at some of the items in one of the cases we have in the museum, you can see just how neat, how beautiful some of them are. You might recognize this famous poster of the tailor sewing the young boy's trousers. Has the iconic red hand, the Barber's symbol. And as well as, when thinking about them, the marketing was brilliant, but their products were absolutely ubiquitous. They were everywhere, used in embroidery and stitching. They were used for fishing nets, golf thread, shoelaces, telephone wire, thread for needlework, crochet, and lacework. And this spool, which is one of the items that I'd like us to think about. I mean, we know it dates from around about 1900. It's pre-partition Lisburn, you know, Lisburn, Ireland, not Lisburn, Northern Ireland. I mean, it's quite a small object. You can hold one in your hand, but I don't want the size to belie its significance. You know, millions were sold. It was used everywhere. I mean, it's a really important object in the history of Lisburn, the Lagan Valley, but also textiles and fashion more broadly. But beyond these, what we might think of everyday objects, we have high fashion, and this is one of my favorite objects that we have in the museum. It's a well, when I first saw it, I thought it was a proof cloth, like some of the proof cloths that Fiona was chatting about. But actually, it's a commemorative cloth, and it was woven in linen and silk to mark the visit of Queen Victoria to Belfast in August of 1849. It was woven by James Coulson, and it was presented. It was the sort of pièce de résistance at the White Linen Hall in Belfast, and Queen Victoria was a fan of the Coulsons. The family had been granted a royal warrant in 1811, and they had been manufacturing damask in Lisburn from 1760s or so. After William Coulson, the patriarch, had died, his sons had taken over, although they later fell out, as people tend to do in business. And this was produced in the workshop of James Coulson, which looked like this, which was divided between the sons. So what's remarkable about this is that 1849 is really the heyday of handwoven linen damask. I mean, it's the height of fashion. It's used by kings and queens of Europe, the Tsars of Russia, and it's a period before power loom jacquards would really undercut the industry. When, I mean, anybody, not anybody, but almost anybody could square away some damask or use it at home, but this was hand woven linen damask, and it was really at the height of fashion. And if you look, the motifs are fantastic. It shows the date of Queen Victoria's accession, it shows the date of her marriage, and just, I think it might have been obscured by the window on the side. You can see it says Céad Mille Fáilte, so 100,000 welcomes in Irish. So it's a really remarkable object. It's absolutely beautiful. So we're very lucky to be able to walk past this every day in work. As I say, that's the factory, and it was there up until the 1950s, 1960s, when the company went out of business. The Fads College was sort of went derelict. It was eventually flattened and turned into a car park, and it's now a library. And the next item I want to talk about, a set of items, relate to Robinson and Cleaver's Royal Irish Linen Warehouse, and they were a major department store, and they sold all sorts of linen goods. The firm had been established in 1870, and then they moved to this building, Young and McKenzie building, at Donegal Place, Donegal Square, in the 1880s, and was opposite the White Linen Hall, which is today's the site of today's City Hall. And the building opened in 1887, early 1888, which is quite appropriate because it's 1888 is the year Queen Victoria granted Belfast city status. I mean, this was Linenopolis at its height, and you can see this print by Marcus Ward and Company. I think it captures something of the glamour and the wealth of the period. You know, Belfast's most magnificent department store on the town's most prestigious street. We have hundreds of items relating to Robinson Cleaver in the collection, from tablecloths to stockings to doilies to embroidered goods and lace. And they were just really lovely, distinctive, ornate catalogues, like the catalogue on the left here. Through this, in the mail order business they sent out more post than anyone else in Belfast from the top floor. They're hugely busy. And in the collection we have this really wonderful bleached linen damask napkin, which was woven for the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1887. What's interesting, and if you can contrast this to the Coulson cloth from earlier, is that this is a set of 5, which makes me think that perhaps it was woven to be sold and not just to be presented. But you can see it captures the building, and there's some text at the bottom marking the Jubilee of Queen Victoria. The next item is this. It's a photograph, and I've chosen this photograph, and it shows workers from Hillsborough Linen Company, which was formed in about 1866, 67, sometime around there. Up until the 1960s, they were in operation. And we don't have a precise date for this photo. It's likely about 1910 or so. And it would be typical of the reading and winding rooms in mills right across Ulster during this period. I mean, from 1850 to just after the First World War, Belfast and the surrounding district was the linen capital of the world. We went from, at one stage, having 120 power looms. You could count them on several people's hand, maybe, through to 31,000 power looms. I mean, massive industry. In terms of spindles, we went from 300,000 to 800,000. It was a booming industry. But I think it gets lost sometimes. 70% of the workers were actually women. And I think it's important to see the face of the Irish linen industry. They often work in very difficult circumstances. Many were not unionized, had long hours, often had kids on half-time contracts up until the 1920s. They battled poor health, poor working conditions. Although Hillsborough Weaving Company as a rural mill, I mean, the services that the mill facilities may have been slightly better than working in, say, inner city Belfast. What's interesting in this period is we do see lots of mill villages popping up all around Ulster, at Hildon, of course, at Sand Mills, at Bestbrook and Cumber. I mean, they're really important parts of the industrial landscapes. So important that we don't really know what to do with them in Northern Ireland and other land decay. As someone who works in a museum, I think it's quite striking that in terms of material culture, we don't have that much relating to the women who work in these factories. We often don't know who they are, although they're remembered as millies. We don't necessarily know them as individuals. This can sometimes be a derogatory term. We don't have their clothes. They're not the sort of objects that come into museum collections. We don't know the bobbins they're winding. We don't know necessarily what they were used for, what they were used. It could have been to be used in weaving or dyeing of yarns. And although they would have had quite a rich oral culture, it's mainly recorded in books and long after the facts. So I think it's really important that if we had a room 101 where we could submit objects relating to the Irish industry, I mean, a scene like this would have to go into it. Finally, I know I've probably nearly reached my time here. I suppose just to conclude, it's quite difficult to choose a few items to highlight the whole collection. But I think I've picked a few that are emblematic from the collection and to give you a taste of some of the items that we have and which tell interesting stories. The beauty of museum collections, I suppose, is that they can speak differently to different people. What I choose is someone who's not a textile historian or necessarily a fashion expert. It's different to what you might pick, but I think that's great as it speaks to the multitude of stories that objects can tell, and slightly underpins the importance of museums as depositories and custodians of that history. This is a scene finally from our weaving workshop, which has been an enterprise ongoing since 1994, where we have 2 damask looms, jacquard mechanisms on top, and we have, when the wind is good, 2 full-time weavers producing proof cloth like the Prince of Wales cloth on my left, or other designs. They recently produced a damask napkin to mark Royal Hillsborough. So thanks very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ciaran, thank you so much for that presentation about the Irish Linen Centre. I mean, I think you've sold it to several of us, because I can see looking in the Q&A, there are lots of people saying, right, I feel a trip to Northern Ireland coming on. I think we're probably going to have to spearhead that somehow. I'm going to pass over to Anna for questions.
Okay. What an amazing talk. Thank you very much. So Lynn's right. You're going to have a flood now of visitors. We all want to come and see you.
Well, you're very welcome,
Ciaran, do you want to stop sharing? Sorry, can you just stop sharing your screen there?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, great. No, we get the time. That's great. Thanks ever so much. Sorry, Anna.
Okay, so Hannah is asking about Quaker connections and Quaker pieces in your collection. And she's wondering if this is due to geography and a good population of friends within the locale.
Yes, absolutely. There's Quaker settlement here between Belfast, Lisburn, Lagan, that sort of axis from the 17th century onwards. I mean, there's still a Quaker meeting house in Lisburn and Hillsborough. And Quakers were heavily involved in the linen industry across the Lagan Valley. I mean, the Huguenots often get credit for bringing linen to Ireland and promoting the industry, but they were much better at marketing themselves than actually producing linen. And the theory is that it was Quakers mainly moving in from northern England in the mid 17th century that really fostered the industry. So yeah, hugely important.
And obviously a number of Quaker schools which produce the skilled workers to carry it on as well.
Yeah, I mean, the history of the Irish industry is pockmarked with influential Quakers, the Richardson family, the Hancock family. I mean, they really left a mark on bleaching, weaving, all aspects of it. Hugely important,
Yeah. I mean, just from my own research point of view, there was a lot of uptake of linen amongst Friends because it chimed with anti-slavery principles in that it was not cotton and it was not from the USA, where it had been picked by the enslaved. So I'm thinking that would also boost it. Hannah's pointing out that she's going to be talking about Queen Victoria's 1849 visit as well in her talk.
Brilliant.
Emma would like to know the origins of the flax. So does Irish linen mean that it's grown locally in Ireland?
No, this is particularly in the end of the 19th century. So Ireland has a great reputation for the production of linen, but for growing of flax, we're not so good. So by the end of the 19th century, there's lots and lots of the flax that's actually imported from Belgium and from Russia. So the higher quality flax comes from Russia, lower quality flax, sorry, the lower quality flax comes from Russia, higher quality comes from Belgium, because the Belgium, they seem to have the retting process down much better than the Russians. So you can see the issue then when the First World War breaks out. I mean, where do you get your flax supply come from? Because Russia and Belgium are obviously intimately tied up with the conflict. So then during the First World War in particular, as a microcosm of it, there's a huge effort to increase the domestic production of flax. It was actually a threefold increase during the First World War as they try and meet demand. But it's one of those things. Ireland was a great linen producing region, but not a great producer of flax.
Interesting, because geographically it should be able to do it. It's got the water and the land, and just didn't gear up to it. Lynn is asking, is it possible to search the collections online at the Irish Linen Centre, or do we need to come and see you?
Yeah, it's not possible just yet. Give us time. We're getting there. It takes it takes a bit of work to get that all online. But yeah, we'd love to get to that situation. I mean, if you drop us an email, I mean, the collections are there. We want people to use them. So drop us an email and we'll happily facilitate research visits. You know, come and use the facilities. You're more than welcome.
Nice. Do you have any pieces from earlier periods? I maybe missed that in your talk. I mean, do you have anything made by outworkers in workers' cottages, sort of relating to the 17th century and first half of the 18th century, or would you say it's the bulk of it is made within manufacturers, as it were?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't think of any 17th century textiles that we have in the collection. I mean, one of the issues with the Huguenots is they left no trace of the cloth that they produced. We do have a very early 18th century cloth, perhaps the most important piece of Irish linen damask. Now, it doesn't belong to us, it belongs to Winchester Cathedral, but it's the Waringstown cloth that was produced in 1727 for the accession of George II. And I actually had it on the PowerPoint and went, oh, it's a bit too early, I'll take it out, which is a bit of a shame, because it uses a pamphlet from early 18th century that had a map of London, and actually reproduces a map and the coronation parade on on the cloth. Yeah, it's a really wonderful piece, and it's the earliest piece. Maybe Roisin or Fiona could correct me, but I'm pretty sure it's the earliest piece of Irish linen damask that we have. We're having we want to get that on display soon. There's been a couple of requests for people to have it on display, but putting the cloth on display, I think it's 11 foot by 9 foot. It's not without its challenges. There's conservation challenges. I mean, there's not that many textile conservators in Ireland, so getting all this together is proven quite difficult. But it is our aim to facilitate the filming and B, so it's on view for the public. We're trying to get to that position pretty soon.
Okay.
And I think we may need to move on. I'm just conscious of time. You just want to ask one more question, and then we'll move over to Roisin.
Okay, there's a couple more in the chat if people want to have a look at these. Workers or adults working within the factory, would you say? Katrina's asking, were the factory workers all adults or did children also work there?
I mean, it's such a long period. I mean, the linen industry in Belfast in the early 19th century is markedly different from, well, mid 19th century is markedly different from that at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. But half time as a process was there on the books up until 1920. There was plenty of children who would have worked half-time system. With the various factory acts over time, things did get better. There's a famous James Connolly quote about linen mills are like penitentiaries for the children, and I can't even remember. I'm going to butcher the quote, but but they're very difficult, particularly in the mid 19th century. Really difficult, really harsh conditions. I mean, I think it's one of the things. There's rose-tinted glasses with the linen industry, but there's people forget how difficult the system was to work under, and the industrial deaths and the fires and all sorts. You know, it was very difficult.
And there's one last little question from Erin saying, was printed linen common, or were the patterns mostly woven in made by damask?
Printed linen. I'm trying to think if we have any printed linen. You see a lot of that in early 20th century. I know about this because of there's a great PhD thesis by Catherine O'Hara on printed linen damasks from the Old Bleach Linen Company. I don't know of any from the 19th century, but that's, you know, that could be just my ignorance and not knowing. So apologies, I can't give you a good answer.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Ciaran, for a wonderful introduction to the Irish Linen Centre. It was absolutely fabulous. I'm going to pass over then on to our third speaker this afternoon, Roisin Aiston, who comes from the Ulster Folk Museum, so another one of Northern Ireland's great institutions. Roisin graduated from Queen's University Belfast with a degree in archaeology and paleoecology. Gosh, that's a terrible word to try and pronounce. In 2008, and then joined the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum the following year in 2009. Began weaving in 2013 with, in fact, one of Ireland's or Ulster's last damask linen weavers, John McAtasney. So she had a wonderful teacher, and she is part of this sort of reenactment at the Ulster Folk Museum, and she will tell you more about that and the work that she does there. And I have to say that the linens that Roisin produces are absolutely amazing because we use them in our embroidery workshop. So we're absolutely delighted to have her here this afternoon to talk to you. Roisin, I'm going to pass over to you if you want to.
Brilliant. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm not terribly great with anything beyond 1900 technology, but we'll give it a go.
That's fine.
So my talk's quite surreal, and it's just my own experience from being a 21st century person, spending half of my life working with 1900s looms. And the museum represents Ireland as it would be between about 1900 and about 1910. So it's quite specific in what it's trying to represent. So we do quite a lot of things, but hopefully I'll cover most of it in this wee presentation. So yeah, as Ciaran was saying, and we all know it, linen flax has been around for an awfully long time, woven for about 6,000 years. Ireland starts to really touch on it, and you see Ulster especially, with the amount of spinning mills, weaving factories and bits and pieces that we have. But there was an awful lot from farming it, scutching it, spinning it in homesteads, and then also weaving it in a cottage industry sense. So this was a quick timeline. We do start to see Irish yarn and bits and pieces starting to come through 1200. But as Ciaran also said, from about 1700, Ireland, Ulster was definitely a world player in competing with the likes of France for quality and also what it was capable of doing. Even if you look, I've put a circle over above it, but even before the turn of 1700, we were already running about 500 hand looms, which is quite a lot when you consider the province. This is just a quick rundown through, and as Ciaran touched on as well, as the museum deals with about 1900 and 1910, you see this massive shift. Power looms are introduced into Ulster around about 1850s. They start to take hold, and you start to see that shift between power loom weaving and the hand loom weaving. Power loom weaving takes a big hold, but there's still 2,500 of these little hand looms still in existence. They actually do still work commercially right up until the 1960s. And the last comment that I make there is the likes of John McCollum, who was in Warringstown and also in Lagan. He passed away in 1963. He was a big hand loom manufacturer, But Yurts, who was one of our biggest power loom weavers and one of our biggest factories, actually takes his business over for another 5 years. So you can see even at that point, hand looms and hand loom woven linen was still quite valuable. Generally for a napkin, you can be talking anywhere between 16 and 18 hours work. So without saying very much, if you have Irish hand woven linen damask and it's usually woven into the side of the napkin, that screams money without you having to say anything. That's what the Edwardian era, especially in its heyday, Edwardian Victorian, was all about. It was all about talking about how much you're worth without ever saying anything about it. Same with some of the specialisms in design, as Fiona touched on, the likes of John Shaw Brown, doing cloths, mass producing them. If you could afford to have something like your family crest or motto woven into your fabric, jeepers, that was an awful lot of money without you even having to say that you're worth that. Just touching on one of the questions actually from earlier, there did start to be limits on what age you could actually start to work. So in our era, it was from 12 years old. Before that, you weren't allowed to work in the factory. But if you go right the way back into that mid 1800s and the mid Victorian, you could start work from 9 years old. In some of the cotton industries, you can see even from 6 years old and 7 years old. So as Ciaran said, there's a lot of change within legislation. So the likes of where I'm based, I would be doing about 10 hours a day, 5.5 days a week easily. This is just touched on what the museum does, and it's lovely to be able to do it because you can step right back into it. That's my dirty pause from a couple of years ago. We do grow flax on site. It actually takes pretty well, and then we will actually go in and start to hand pull it. You can see why they throw a whole village at it at that point in time. It takes an awful lot. The museum also has a scutch mill. It also has a bleach screen that's just behind there. So we have 3 buildings dedicated to the linen industry in 1900. One scutching mill, one bleach screen from Tullylish, and then also the little house that is my home from home, which is Ballydugan Weavers. And I'm kind of hoping to have it in order. Yeah. So this is what it would have been. This is from the Green Collection. You can, if you want to search this on our website, you can. We have a picture library online. So it shows a hand loom weaver in Moira, and another one which is Coulson, which shows the sheer size of one of those big tablecloth looms, and the amount of punch cards. If maybe mouse will move, you can see all the punch card sets, and also the way that the harness is tied up through that loom as well. And like I touched on, the last one that we have is John McCollum's, and that's where John served his time, and he was the gentleman who had started to teach me at the start of it all. We're lucky in our collections that we actually do have some of McCollum's booklets. We also have some of his cloths, so we can refer to it as well. Now, this is the last I'm going to say on modern stuff and then get stuck into what I do. But this is Ferguson's out in Banbridge. So the museum tries to make a link between what we used to do in 1900 and then also start to refer to what people do now. So this is just a snapshot of a power loom in action, because you'll see a wee hand loom in action at some stage. But this is one of theirs going in Banbridge. So very methodical. These little bits here I love because this will pick up if there's a broken thread, whereas I have a slide shot that you can see what happens to me if I get a broken thread in the 1900s one. So this is my loom. I spend more time with her than I do with anybody else in my family, but she is from about 1900. We also have a damask loom in the weaving shed as well. And this is what a typical day for me looks like. So they walk down to Ballydugan on a nice autumny day, and then that's Ballydugan's Weaver's Cottage on this side. So it is from Lagan. It's one of our few replicas on site. Most of the buildings in the museum are taken down brick by brick. This one couldn't be. It's mainly clay wall construction, a little bit of fieldstone, a little bit of brick in the chimney, but most of it is clay. So the weaving shed is on this side of the building. There's 2 big massive windows on this side, 2 big massive windows at the back, and there's only 5 other windows in the rest of the building. This is what I try and tell the story of. The family that lived there was mum and dad, there was James and Margaret, and then they actually had 6 kids, 3 sons, 3 daughters. Elizabeth and Ellen, by the 1901 and 1910 census, they were still listed as weavers. You can see it, cambric handling weavers, just in their occupation. But they'd lost their youngest son, and the mother of the house passed away. The other 3 got married and actually moved. So there was at one stage 5 weavers within the house, 4 looms. This is one of my biggest reasons for doing it. If you look at it, that's my grandmother's. census record, her birth record, and you can just about see soldier and weaver from my great-great-grandfather. My granny and granddad were both weavers, but in power loom factories. So there's something there that makes it quite fun. This is one I wanted to bring in because I can't bring you to the museum. I wish I could. If you do a field trip, you can come and visit. But it's just 2 little videos to show what the loom's like in action. Hopefully the noise works because the sound of it is quite something else. So this is just what I would do on a normal day-to-day basis to get it to run. Oh no! Sideways on. What you gonna do? It is quite a noisy thing. I apologize for the tilt in the videos, but it gives you an idea. It's all practice, and it's getting used to throwing the shuttle, moving the heddles, and moving the reed back at the same time. On your first couple of weeks, you do make a lot of mistakes with them. These are the tools that I would use. So the one on the left-hand side is a mid-1900s shuttle. It was getting to the point that it was too old. The shuttle moves about 8 foot a second. So if it bounces out and hits a wall, you're at great risk of damaging it. The other one on the right-hand side is one that I talked my husband into making. So it's a wee bit more substantial. It's been running pretty well now for about 5 years. And then your other biggest thing is your heddle hook. So my loom carries 1,580 warp threads. The damask loom or the jacquard loom carries 2,500. And to thread them up, that's the equipment that you're given, is a heddle hook, which is, it's always good fun. And that's a view across the back of the loom. So you can see the warp threads, 1,580 from one side to the other. And then you have what's called a cross. And that's what keeps everything in order. So thread 1 must move before thread 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In the museum, it will take me about 2 weeks to thread up the plain linen loom. If it was my own private business, it would take about 2 days. Jacquard loom is a completely different story. It's about probably about 6 months maybe to do a full rethread on it. Referring back to the Ferguson's video, if you look really closely in this image, if anybody can try and spot it, in that 1,580 threads, one snapped, and it snapped in the back beam. If anybody can spot it, it took me a couple of goes. You can just see the end, and the end it attaches to. So that's always good fun. That's always a good challenge. We use what are called point glasses. You'll have all come across this before, but it's just to show you what my setup is. And the warp comes through the heddles in 3, so you can see it really defined. And then the weft from the cross. So it carries 52 in the warp, 70 in the weft. So it's not a bad, doesn't seem to be a bad cloth to work with. This is the little jacquard loom. So this is one that has been one of my biggest challenges. John did teach me a lot of the basics, but he refused to teach anybody how the jacquard ran. So this was a little while ago, and I was able to get it up and running. You can see the punch cards engaging, the pins lifting, and then the pins down here starting to lift threads. So it's been fun to try and figure that one out because there really isn't an instruction manual for a jacquard loom. So it's a lot of trial and error. And this is what it looks like. So you have the punch cards that run up the back. That carries obviously its pattern. It goes down through the harness, and that in turn will tell the loom what threads to start to lift. The view that you have on this side of the tenters holding the cloth under tension, the little reed, and then the cloth that's actually produced. This is one of the last runs of cloth that John did. This one's called the Deer and the Fern. One of my proudest moments was it was mentioned I'd never be able to figure out or run it. And on the loom as it sits at the minute, there's the tiniest little bit of blue cloth that's on the side of it. And if you look, there's one little statement that says Irish hand woven. And that took me about 6 years to ponder, to try and get that loom back up and running. And you can just see it in more detail. And out of everything that I've done, that is probably one of the best moments ever, that what I hoped that loom was doing, it did. Again, touching on what Ciaran and Fiona have already said, we have a massive collection that I can refer to and hopefully start to pull together to help support that loom. So from the likes of the drawings and the sketches, the point paper then would be created, and then you can see that image then coming across in the finished cloth. It's an awful lot of work, but it's lovely to see the two beside each other. So we do have a collection of point paper, proof cloth, and then finished cloth that we can actually tie in. This one's quite gorgeous with the alpine scene. And as Fiona said, we do have proof cloths. Fiona, I think some of these are John Shaw Brown's, actually. We do have quite a big, it talks about lower lodge, so it's all the sign-offs. One of the best ones I've ever seen is you can see somebody who checked the proof cloths going through the cloth and Xing it with pencils left, right and centre, and then just losing the head at the end of it and just said scrap. Just too many problems with machines. So from doing that on a day-to-day basis, I'd be demonstrating for the public and showing them how the looms work, fill in gaps that they would have in their own family tree and their own history. Everybody in Ulster has generally somebody somewhere associated with the linen industry. You'd be hard pushed not to. It was just so big. So that's what I do, try and work alongside with our Cure of Textiles, Valerie, to try and make those looms speak. Because if we can't do it for them, they just don't, and tell the history of those families that used to run it. But through that, as Lynn said, I have got roped into some amazing things. So I worked with Jenny Adam Christie in doing what was called the Ulster Pocket. It was based on the Ballyhosset quilt that we have. It's about mid to late 1600 coverlet. So she worked with my linen. I think it was the biggest piece I'd ever made, of about 20 meters. Have worked with ornamental embroidery and was able to actually go over to one of their courses in Blythe House, which was lovely to work on Jacobean blackwork, because they would have been only working ever on hand woven linen. So to be able to provide hand woven linen for that's quite amazing. Same with Dr. Alexandra Mackin for her book, and also some of the samples that she wants to do for it. It's exceptionally hard now to get plain hand woven linen. Most people just avoid it. You'll see most people will go for tweeds or oh jeepers, something that there's a market for. There's not a huge amount of market now for hand woven linen, unfortunately. Another one that I got roped into, which was really surreal, but it's some of the things the museum tries to do, is tie everything from the past into present day. So one of the ones we got to work on, which was amazing, was the Game of Thrones tapestry. So it was woven on a hand shot well, it's not a jacquard loom, damask loom or dobby loom. So it was telling that what threads lift, but it's where threads was put in by hand, and then we embroidered bits and pieces on it as well. It was incredible. Huge undertaking. I think it's been on display now 3 or 4 times, and it actually went to debut last year. And there's other stuff that I middle about with as well. So the tin pan from our print shop is linen. So every now and then some of my stuff gets used on it and gets covered in ink. Also little embroideries. I've dabbled in doing some of our houses in small form, and then you can see the bigger house to the right hand side. Also quite surreal, and this is I think it's my last slide because I'm nearly over, but we are in full 1900s costume, so learning how to weave in 1900s gear is quite interesting, especially in a full skirt. And this I laughed at from doing wanders around the site, and you can see how dirty the petticoat gets. We quote from Pride and Prejudice. Also have swallows that visit the building. But yeah, it's the most surreal place to work, but it's amazing to give something breath and something life that not many people do anymore. Same with the jacquard. Lisburn have 2 that run. We have 1 here, but listed in the UK, there's only about 5 or 6 people who are listed as able to run a jacquard, which is a massive part of our heritage, and it's not worth letting it go. So hopefully we can get ours up and running again. It's due a full rethread. But I think that's me way over time, so I'm gonna stop talking now.
Roisin, thank you so much for the introduction to the work that you do at the Ulster Folk Museum. That's absolutely fabulous. And you know, as someone who uses your linen to teach on through ornamental embroidery, I can tell everyone it's absolutely amazing. I think it's the archaeology involved in what you do that's just so important. I mean, that's what I love. I mean, as somebody who's teaching historic stitch, to be able to go to you and say, we need this certain textile because it's, you know, it's as close as we can get to what was woven at a particular time for whatever workshop it is that we're trying to teach at. So, you know, thank you for all the research that you do, and I look forward very much to seeing the progress that you made with the jacquard, because that's going to be interesting when you produce more damask cloth. I'm going to hand over to Anna for Q&A, please.
Okay, so actually not many questions have come in. I think basically we're all sitting here in stunned silence. I think you've kind of blown our minds a bit with this. It's so incredible to see you working at these historic, extraordinary piece of equipment and figuring it out and getting your head around how to do this work and kind of standing in the shoes of. It's good. The questions are coming in. Bear with. Okay, so we have Z is asking, do you have advice for a modern hand weaver who wants to learn how to do things the historical way?
The best advice is to equip yourself in the way that they would have been. So the likes of using heddle hooks, doing a lot of it by hand, even the likes of, and this is going to sound ridiculously weird, but even the likes of lighting or heating. And try and figure out where you would put loom lights. We have electric lights, but sometimes I'll turn them off and go by a little tiny torch just to see what it was physically like. Even as something as simple as me weaving in a full length skirt, you can see how difficult that is and where you would hitch it up or tuck it in somewhere to make that. As even getting up on top of the jacquard loom to get up on that engine's about 8 foot high, and you can just imagine somebody hitching their skirt up to do so. Because so yeah, that would be my best advice, is only equip yourself with what they would have had and then figure it out. These guys would have used everything and anything, and do it. Don't be too scared of going, oh, that's one of our looms has a bicycle pedal on it as a rubber buffer. Rubber buffers came in on bikes, so yoink, I'll use that because that makes it easier. So it's not being scared to try stuff out.
Right, okay. How, I mean, Kate is saying amazing, amazing, amazing. How physically hard is it to work the loom? I mean, do you need muscles? Do you need to be nimble? What do you need to do?
No, you'll build up muscles you never thought you needed to have ever. It would be the best example I can give you if you get really, really bored is hold like 2 tins in each hand and keep stamping your feet on the ground and move those tins and do that for about 8 hours and see what that feels like. A lot of those weavers, and I'm still at risk of it, of repetitive strain, carpal tunnel syndrome, slip discs in your back, all that kind of stuff. It is exceptionally physical if you're not moving, the loom isn't. So yeah, and the only thing is your lead arm is stronger than your not lead arm, so you end up getting more muscles on one side than you did the other.
Oh, like a potter throwing, and with a kick wheel, you end up with a big old fat right thigh and a little skinny left.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, are you able to access diaries or readers' notes? I mean, do you get a kind of an input from the literary, historical, as well as looking at the cloth and the looms?
Yeah.
Can you piece it together?
Even the likes of weaver songs and poets, you get a rhythm, and every loom will run to its own rhythm, and every weaver will run to their own rhythm. So you get a song in your head. Thankfully, I can carry a tune in the bucket, so I don't sing. But I will weave away with it with a song. The loom's actually been sampled by a couple of people who are into music to let her accompany them with their songs. We have an oral history of linen within the museum, and it's lovely because they just interview people and said, tell me your experience. So it wasn't in an academic realm. It was, what was it like to work the looms? What was it like to work in the factories? What was it like to work in the mills? And they're brutally honest.
Oral histories. Azadeh's asking, well, she says it's wonderful to see the jacquard loom clunking away, especially given that punch cards were essentially the predecessor of the modern day computer. So what an amazing thing to see. Jennifer's asking, can you please repeat again the length of time it takes to thread the looms?
Okay. So for the cambric, the plain linen one, if I was to do that, I could just close the door, not have to talk to anybody, not have to speak to anybody. For 1,580 threads, it would totally take roughly about 2 to 3 days. In the museum, it's about 2 weeks. For the jacquard loom, again, way back then, you would have had people who you could have approached and said, I need a loom rethreaded, and they would have done it, or you would have been throwing everybody the full loom rethread. But 2,500 threads through 3 different threading points is a hard thing to do. In the museum, our jacquard hasn't been rethreaded since the 1970s. So I'm looking at probably doing it within the next year. I'm hoping if I can get threads for it, but I would be estimating probably about 6 months to do it from start to finish. And that's because I've never done it before.
Wow, what a project.
Yeah, you don't need patience to start, but it'll teach you as you go.
Catherine's, we've got a silk question, but I might leave that to the end if there's any time. Catherine's asking about excavations at factories or workers' houses to piece together the kind of the archaeological picture. Any thoughts on that?
For ours, the best example that I can actually give you is when we took Ballydugan, the looms had actually been removed. So whenever they went in to look at the building, because they knew it was a typical weaver's cottage because of where it was in the census, who owned it, they actually did look at the floor to see the looms are actually buried. And they do an awful lot of shaking, a lot of moving. So the looms are actually dropped into the floor, and they were able to find the evidence of the 4 looms sitting. But yeah, even if I dig up the floor of Ballydugan, I find stuff that we have dropped over the last 50 years that you find wee heddle hooks or pins or needles or loom eyes or loom weights or something. It's all clay floor. So even in a weaving shed itself, you'll find evidence of things that have been dropped.
Okay. And they were never upstairs, were they? It was always ground floor.
Generally, yeah. There is evidence of it in England more, but for us, it was always ground floor, window heavy on one side and cold. Linen doesn't mind if it's warm, but it likes being damp. It likes being cool. So you'll weave better in the winter when it's about 5 degrees in the weaving shed. In the summer, it'll get up to about 16, and that's a bit too balmy.
God, it sounds absolutely my worst nightmare. It's cold and damp all day long. Which brings us to any ill effects like lungs. Do you need to wear any sort of protection when you're doing it? Have you got a good face mask on?
No, we did do, because it's only me. If you had the 4 looms going, it's nearly like getting a talcum powder bottle and doing that, and you'll see all the what's called pice, which is the little fibers that come off the flax. Because it's only me, the loom actually catches a lot of that. We have done a dust report on it and a fibre report. Nothing hugely came up on that, but I do need to take regular breaks, more for the physicality. At the minute, I'm at risk of slip discs and RSI, so it's more that. The biggest risk to me is hearing loss. That loom runs at about 100 and so decibels.
No.
So you must wear hearing protection. 40 minutes will give you a really good headache. Anything beyond that, you'll start to go home with a bumping head. So yeah, earplugs is key, especially for linen. It's just so strong. It's just the strength of the cloth that you hear.
That's such an insight into what people endured.
It is. Thank you so much, Roisin. That was absolutely wonderful, really to sort of see history in action. That's absolutely fabulous. Which takes me on to our 4th speaker today, and we're moving from the production of textiles to an actual object of clothing, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Hannah Rumball, who is one of our committee members of 19th century dress and textiles reframed. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton and specialises in 19th and early 20th century dress, material culture and women's studies, with an emphasis on Quaker plain dress and its fashionable adaptation. So that's why there have been questions coming in from Hannah specifically about the Quakers, and I'm sure there's a lot more to learn when you have your trip to Ulster later in the year, Hannah. Hannah's been doing quite a lot of research already on the Ulster coat and has published an article on that in Textile and the Journal of Cloth and Culture. And I think this is moving forward in her research, so she's coming across more and more material on this. Hannah, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn. Just checking you can see my screen and you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Fine. Great, cool. Just a polite note, if you can refrain from taking any photographs or any screenshots of my slide today. I know it's tempting. I love to do it when I see really cool things. I'm just trying to preserve my research at this stage. I've kind of found some really exciting things, but don't worry, I'm working it up into an article, so you'll have your hands on it soon enough, I'm sure. So as Lynn mentioned, my previous article that I published in 2022 was focusing on the Ulster overcoat as used by women. And this presentation today will instead look at the invention of the men's Ulster in 1866 and consider its popularity and dissemination during the 19th century. Now, little is known about its inventor, the Northern Irish tailor and businessman John Getty McGee, despite his claim to fame. The main source of research on the Ulster overcoat and on John Getty McGee has previously been Jack McCoy's The Ulster Coat, which was an article published in 1985, to which I remain indebted. My presentation today pieces together details from McGee's life. It considers McGee as a tailor and a businessman, and the Ulster overcoat's place in 19th century fashion and textile history. What I'm presenting to you today is very much a work in progress, so bear with me. I'm focusing on the detective work that I've been doing, and I'm going to show you the primary research that I've found and that I've been consulting in order to build up a picture of this important but unknown and under-researched clothier. Much of what I'm presenting today is what could best be described as postcards of a life. I don't yet have a complete picture of McGee as yet, but the sporadic sources of detail are beginning to meet to become a rich and vibrant history. So John Getty McGee was born in Antrim in 1816. Now, I've been researching the Ulster for about 3 years now, and I had never found a photograph or an image of McGee until last week. So finding this was extremely exciting for me. This image, while undated, was clearly taken later in his life, but it gives us a good sense of the man that we're discussing today. Through newspaper research, I found his marriage notice in the press, which tells us that on the 28th of April in 1840, he married Catherine Moorhead, who was from Dublin. And I've also found a photograph of her. Now, both of these photographs of John and Catherine McGee are undated, but in this image of Catherine, she appears to be heavily pregnant. Now, I know the McGees had 8 children across the span of about 14 years between 1841 and 1855. And from the dress, I would suggest this photograph shows Catherine McGee in the 1850 to 1855 period. Now, by 1843, we know that McGee had set himself up with a very grand tailors and clothiers establishment at 48 High Street in Belfast. Now, I'm not sure how best to say the name of McGee's shop, because it's a word that I've only ever read. I haven't actually heard anyone else say it. So if anyone knows how to pronounce this correctly, then please do let me know. But I'm going to kind of cobble my way through this. I'll do my best. So his shop was named the Pantech Net Hecker, and you can see that I've put an arrow to it there. And this is the same name as a very famous Regency store that had opened in Birmingham, in Britain, in about 1824. And the Pantech Net Hecker in Birmingham displayed and sold a selection of manufactures and arts which were considered the best wares of Birmingham. And what's important for us to know is that by 1843, the Pantech Net Hecker in Birmingham had actually been bought and taken over by a very famous tailors called Hyam & Co. Now, anyone who knows anything about tailoring, especially during the 19th century, will know the name of Hyam & Co. They became arguably the most important tailors during the 19th century. But in 1843, Hyam & Co. also owned 48 High Street in Belfast. And what the advert on the left teaches us is that by this time, McGee was acting as an agent for Hyam & Co. at 48 High Street, Belfast. So he was already associated with quite a prestigious kind of firm. Now, fashion agents represent and sell a brand's goods while providing additionally locally based services. So what McGee would have been doing was selling Hyam & Co. goods here, but he would also have been selling his own tailoring wares as well. And really, this is importantly where his story as a renowned tailor really begins. The advert on the right illustrates to us that in the space of 6 months, McGee had stopped using the Hyams name in his advertising for the Pantech Net Hecker in Belfast. Now, I've learned through other research that Hyams didn't stop being involved in the Belfast venture. They were still financially involved. But clearly, McGee felt confidence enough in his own name and his own products to no longer rely on the cachet associated with Hyam & Co. According to the Belfast Evening Telegraph, McGee's Pantech Net Hecker became known as one of the best and most successful clothing establishments in Belfast. Using Prony's historic maps collection, we can see where 48 High Street was located in about 1843. And it's where I've marked the red dot on this map. It was based in the heart of the city in the main thoroughfare, a prestigious and vibrant location for a tailor early in his career. Indeed, there are telltale signs throughout my research into McGee that suggest he was highly ambitious, as well as a shrewd marketer, and with an understanding of the power of branding. One find that confirms this are the commemorative coins which McGee produced to give to his patrons of the Pantechnet Hecka to commemorate the visit to Belfast of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in 1849. While they were made of a cheap base metal, this collector's item would have linked his brand with royal memorabilia, fusing his name with an important, memorable, and royal occasion. Further important evidence of his ambitions can be found in a letter written by McGee in November 1852. It recounts how McGee sent a Mr. Charles Swan, who had previously been in his employment for 7 years, to Melbourne, Australia on a ship named the Albatross. The purpose of this voyage was for Mr. Swan to take out with him ready-made clothing and other goods and to send the money back to John McGee. Unfortunately, this letter refers to the fact that nearly a year and a half after Mr. Swan was sent to Australia, McGee has received none of the money anticipated for the sale of any of these goods. I think this letter shows us several things. The peril undertaken and also the trust required for a clothing manufacturer to send their goods to Australia. The file contains no replies, and so we are left to speculate about the whereabouts and safety of our Mr. Swan. The outlay by McGee of over £688 worth of ready-made clothing on this venture, an absolutely enormous sum at this time, entrusted to an employer who would become unreachable, illustrates that McGee thought this a really worthy gamble. However, it also illustrates the importance that McGee placed on sending his garments to Australia and in opening up his channels of commerce to global regions. We are making out the picture of a man with great ambitions. Importantly for our story, however, McGee's business was not all branding and bluster. He was at heart a tailor, and in the 1860s, he designed the coat that would make his name. John Getty McGee launched the new style of tailored men's overcoat, the Ulster, from his shop in Belfast in 1866. The Ulster was an enveloping overcoat style intended to be worn as the outermost garment. It was advertised as a waterproof activewear garment made from Irish frieze, tweed, or wools, such as cheviot. It was double or single-breasted, worn over the undercoat and fell to knee length or full length. Other distinctive features included a belt and the presence of multiple large flat pockets, including a pocket at the wrist, and it often featured a hood. From 1871 onwards, the firm made a point of promoting itself not just as a tailor's, but as inventors and sole makers of the Ulster coat. The coat was so popular, but that by the opening years of the 1870s, McGee was promoting and producing the design for women as well as for men. Now, 2 of McGee's men's ulsters do survive in the costume collection of the National Trust property Spring Hill, Northern Ireland. And the curators there have been kind enough to share with me some photographs of these rare survivors. I can't impress on you enough how rare these garments are. Men's all-weather wear from this period rarely survives. Early waterproof treatments are highly unstable, and garments of this style were more likely to have been worn until the end of their natural life and then discarded or repurposed than sort of kept and cherished for posterity. So the first is a man's full-length ulster in mid-brown felted wool, which is fully lined in a striped fleeced wool. The coat is very heavy. It has a brown velvet collar, 4 flapped patch pockets at the centre front, and a 6-button button fastening configuration, with all the original buttons still intact. The coat bears the maker's label of the Ulster Coat, McGee & Co. Belfast, inventors and sole makers. There is also a concealed pocket in the lining of the coat, which bears another label of McGee & Co. Belfast 17920. And if anyone knows anything about garment numbering practices during this period, I'd be really interested in talking to you. We can really see the coat come to life when we compare it to the illustration of the Ulster, which McGee & Co. regularly used in their adverts between 1869 and 1890. So this coat, I personally believe, probably dates to about 1871 to 1890, sort of within that region. The second example, which I believe to be a little later, is a caped Ulster, and these were extremely popular from the 1880s onwards. Again, it's a man's Ulster coat in a dark green Melton wool. I know it looks black here, but it's actually a very dark green, with an integral shoulder cape. The coat underneath the cape has 6 large buttons centre front, and the cape has 4 fastening buttons. The coat has 3 patch pockets over the hips and the left breast. I don't have any pictures where the cape is lifted back, so you'll just have to imagine the coat underneath. So I haven't yet seen these coats in the flesh, as it were, but I find it remarkable the way, especially with the brown coat, they look exactly as they are described in the adverts: enveloping, durable, warm, and comfortable. Their remarkable condition is testament to their beautiful production, and it goes some way towards helping us to understand the decades-long enduring appeal of McGee's invention. The style made McGee's name internationally, with his design winning a prize medal at the Philadelphia exhibition in 1876. By the 1880s, however, McGee's health was in serious decline. He was advised to travel to improve his health, and in December 1883, McGee travelled on the SS Servia to New York. However, on the return journey, he succumbed to his ill health. The register of death records him as passing away on the 8th of December 1883 aboard the Servia, and here we can see his cause of death at the age of 67 listed as dropsy. The Belfast Evening Telegraph recorded how the wide circle of friends who enjoyed the friendship of Mr. John G. McGee will learn with unfeigned regret of his rather unexpected death. Mr. McGee's amiability and kindliness of disposition and his generous and open manner gained him hosts of friends. Now, while his name may have fallen from ubiquity nowadays, McGee's invention was imitated and co-opted by practically every tailor in the British Isles and beyond, with the style becoming entirely ubiquitous globally in the final decades of the 19th century. Its warmth and practicality alongside the stylistic tweaks that many tailors brought to each version meant that many styles were ultimately coined as Ulsters, whether they held true to the designs of McGee or not. Despite this, McGee's design clearly captured the zeitgeist of his era and carved a place for Northern Irish design in the annals of dress history. Thank you.
Hannah, thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I'm so delighted you managed to get some images of those 2 coats.
Yes,
That's
me too.
amazing. I have to say, I was just thinking, I mean, my father used to shop in McGee's as a gentleman's outfitters, and I'm just wondering if it's the same family then.
It probably is, yeah. So John McGee handed over to his son, and actually his son did very, very well in business as well, but apparently his son then carried on the business, and during the 20th century, essentially, it started to go into decline. But I don't think it really went anywhere until sort of the mid 20th century. I haven't actually found out when the
well, I mean, this would have been in sort of 60s and 70s. That, I mean, I remember Dad buying from McGee's. So and I'm just wondering now. It'd be really interesting to know. Well, I'm going to pass over to Anna. Thank you for an absolutely wonderful paper. I can't wait to read it in due course.
Okay, so what an amazing paper and what an amazing find. You've actually found these incredible garments.
I know. I knew that so what was interesting, sorry, I know that I'm just wittering on for, I could talk about this for hours. I knew that they existed because Lynn had very kindly sent me a link to a program that had been on in Ireland. It was called something like A Stitch Through Time. And it was a bit like the Great British Sewing Bee, but it was set in Northern Ireland with Northern Irish makers, and it was focusing in on these kind of like these specific ideas of Northern Irish dress, and one of the programs looked at the Ulster, and they actually went to Spring Hill and they looked at one of these coats, and so I saw it on there and I was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. It's there, this is it. So I contacted Spring Hill, heard nothing, and I was like, it's fine, I can just go back and, you know, take some images from the program. Couldn't find the program again anywhere. It's not on YouTube, it's not on the BBC Arc, it's just nowhere. So anyway, so it's been a long journey. Yes, I'm very happy.
Got there. That's so exciting. I missed the Australia connection. Can you talk about what is it? I mean, the Pan was an exhibition, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't really know. So basically okay, so the Pantech McHecker and then the Australia connection are two different things. Maybe I didn't explain that very well. So the Pantech McHecker was really famous. I guess it was like a precursor to a department store in Birmingham. And the idea is that it was set up in Birmingham to kind of display the best of what Birmingham had to offer. So it sold crockery and silversmithing goods and textiles and all these kinds of things. And it opened in about 1824 and it was very famous. Anyway, the people that opened it didn't run it financially very well, and ultimately the Pantech McHecker was taken over by Hyams and Co, who were they were very wealthy tailors at that point. And so that's the link with the Pantech McHecker in Birmingham, that basically Hyam and Co took it over and they seem to have used this name for other branches of stores that they then bought in different places. So other ones in around England, and this one in Belfast as well, which is where McGee ultimately ended up becoming an agent. Now, a few years later, so that was in about 1843, and then by about 1852, so after about 10 years of working at 48 High Street, Belfast, McGee decides that he sort of wants to branch out. And he thinks, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get together. So initially it's about £300 worth of clothing that McGee's has made. They box it up and they ship it out to Australia with this guy, Charles Swan. And they say, okay, so we're going to go to all of these kind of outposts and try and sell McGee's wares. And this is where McGee comes unstuck, because, you know, he sends this guy out and he keeps shipping clothing and he just never gets any money back. So that's what the letter is about.
Right, okay. So this is really interesting because there's a Ned Kelly connection. That's another story. So Australia, so presumably it's to do with gold rush, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Clothing for men.
Yeah. The more I look into it, this was actually relatively standard practice at this point in time, because obviously there was probably some textile and clothing production going on in Australia at that point, but not really. And these sort of centers of work where these men in these towns sort of ended up, essentially what they were doing was they were shipping in these goods, and then an agent would go around and they'd be traveling around selling these kind of, I guess they're not really itinerant workers, but they're people who are arriving in Australia and just trying to make their way in the world, and they move between these sort of small satellite towns. And
for British manufacturers, it was seen as a real opportunity because the Clarks were under the impression that they could get rid of all their seconds, their old boots.
Yeah, and I guess from an Australian perspective as well, you've got that cachet of all the kind of new designs coming in from, you know, from England and from Europe and those kinds of places. So actually they're quite desirable to the Australian market. So
okay, so there's lots of questions in the chat.
Cool.
So Lynn, everyone's saying amazing. Lynn is saying, how long was the Ulster coat popular?
Okay, so it was invented in 1866, and I'm still finding advertisements which talk about the Ulster into the 1920s. But there's an argument to be had that the thing that put paid to it really was the motor car. Because a lot of people talk about the fact that once you have things like the car, you didn't really need something quite as long and big and bulky as an Ulster coat. So you're moving more toward those sort of like half car jackets, which a lot of men wore, which were very, very bulky, but they were actually cut off. And so because the Ulster is full length, it's very long, it's a very, very heavy coat. By the time we're moving towards the motor car, it's sort of not that popular anymore.
It's kind of hard to get your head around when a man would actually wear this thing, because you couldn't wear it on
Yeah.
horse, could you?
It was worn a lot for essentially driving in on traps. It was worn during hunting. So whether you were stalking hunting, so the main one was, you know, when you're walking hunting. So you've got your gun, you've got your followers behind you. The weather might not be very good.
Right.
So you need to be, you know, you might be in Scotland or somewhere. That's generally where these things were being worn. Inclement weather. So, you know, you'd put on your Ulster coat, you'd throw your gun over your shoulder. You'd have all these little pockets for all your, I don't know, like your whistles and your extra shot and all that kind of stuff. So the idea is that it was a sporting coat, but it's not really like we think of sports. It's not like running or something like that. It's like country leisure activities, I suppose. Things where you're going to get wet and muddy and walking through long grass and all those.
It's interesting because it's not. It's a ready-made, so it's not super posh, is it? It's not. You know.
So generally they were made to measure. So semi-ready-made, and then you send in your measurements, and then they'd make it up to an extent to your size. I'm sure with tailors like McGee, if you were a very wealthy person and you wanted one specifically made that was beautiful and that was, you know, that was not made to measure, you could have whatever you wanted. But yeah, as a general thing, they were sort of they were made to measure wear. And what's interesting is, because of how quickly and how widely they became popular, they became incredibly affordable very, very quickly. So I'm finding adverts from all sorts of different kinds of makers, like cash tailors and things, who were who appealed to the kind of lower stratas of classes. They were making them from the late 1860s, so you could get hold of an Ulster relatively cheaply by that point.
Wow, what a story. So Nancy's asking you, am I right in assuming the caped coat is sleeveless, or am I mixing it up with another style of coat?
I don't know. This is my question as well. I don't think it is. So illustrations that I've seen of caped ulsters are the actual coat. So I guess if you imagine the coat, the brown coat, if you imagine that with an integral cape, so a cape that is essentially sewn in at the neck, then that's what you're looking at when you're looking at a caped ulster. The other version is an Inverness, and that's what normally has the coat with no sleeves and a cape instead. So that's called an Inverness. And I don't think this one is but I don't know, because like I said, I haven't seen it. I don't think it's an Inverness. Yeah, I think it's actually an Ulster.
Mysterious. Elizabeth is asking you, is the British warm based on the Ulster?
Oh, I don't know the British one. One of the things that I discovered when I started out on my journey of ulsters is it's quite complicated trying to figure out what all of the distinct designs actually were, because there are so many designs for men's coats during this mid to late 19th century period. And what's interesting is that they're often very similar with very subtle style distinctions. But I don't know the British one, so I'm going to go away and look that one up. Thank you.
Anna, I think probably we might need to draw those, because I'm conscious that we have overrun quite a bit. I mean, I think it's been a measure of just what a wonderful afternoon it has been. So it just leaves me really to say thank you, Anna, for looking after the Q&A, and thank you to our 4 speakers, Ciaran, Fiona, Roisin, who I'm afraid has had to go off because she's actually at work and on duty today, and I think there's been something has happened at the Ulster Folk Museum she's had to go deal with, and to Hannah for a wonderful collection of papers that have really given us an absolutely fabulous view of Ulster textiles and Ulster clothing. And I can see that there are lots of ideas for trips coming up, so maybe we need to organise a tour at some point. Robin, did you want to say anything about our next session, which will be on the 26th of February?
Before you go, and I did manage to actually get the Eventbrite done, so I've just put a link in the chat, and I can put it again after thank yous. We're having a very unusual at home next month. We've decided, for all the reasons, that what we actually want to do, it's something we wanted to do for a while, and that is have a kind of work in progress, just casual session. So we are inviting everyone to come along, and if you're a person engaged in research. That does not mean that you are an academic necessarily in a higher education institution. It means you are a maker or a curator or an independent person or of any kind. If you're engaged in any kind of research in 19th century dress and textiles, we actually would just want to hear what you're working on. So we're inviting everyone to come along with a few sentences in your brain about what you're doing, maybe ask some questions if you want. You're welcome to put together one slide of images or an image if you'd like to share it on the day. And we're just I'm gonna wing it. I'm running it and I do these kinds of things. So we're gonna see how it goes. We're gonna let you put your virtual hand up and we'll hear from you for a couple minutes. I've said 3 to 5 minutes in the thing. It just depends on how many people come and put their hands up, how long we will have to talk, but we just want to hear what you guys are doing and give you some space to share casually. And like I said, ask questions if you want. So I've put that in the chat, the link to sign up to come along, but you don't have to sign up to speak. And if you are just somebody who likes to come because you're interested and you're not doing anything, just come and listen to everybody else and see what they're up to, because although you may not be doing any research, you might be someone with a wealth of wisdom and you can answer someone's question on the day also. So that's what we're doing. We'll see how it goes. We're quite excited about it, actually.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Robin. So just a final thank you to our 4 speakers. Again, there are lots of lovely comments coming in from the audience. So if you want to unmute yourselves and give them a round of applause, please do so. That would be great. Okay, thanks to all. We'll see you again on the 26th of February at 2 o'clock.